The surface-to-air missile tore through the sky, slamming into $220 million of cutting-edge American technology. In an instant, the RQ-4A Global Hawk was gone, transformed into a rain of debris falling toward the Strait of Hormuz. High-ranking Iranian commanders cheered in their command centers, broadcasting the wreckage to the world as proof that they had finally broken the back of American air superiority. They thought they had drawn a line in the sand that the U.S. Air Force would never dare to cross again. But as the celebration echoed through Tehran, they had no idea they had just walked into a strategic trap that would dismantle their military capabilities for years to come. The Global Hawk wasn't just a drone, it was a flying supercomputer, a ghost in the machine designed to watch everything without ever being seen. It carried no weapons and had no crew, just an array of the most sophisticated sensors ever built by human hands. For hours, it had been feeding a constant, unblinking stream of intelligence back to American commanders, mapping every movement within the region. When Iran pulled the trigger, they believed they were blinding the great Satan and humiliating the most powerful military on the planet. What they actually did was trigger a pre-programmed sequence of events that gave the Pentagon a perfect roadmap of Iran's entire air defense network. Tehran immediately flooded the airwaves with claims that the drone had violated their sovereign airspace, hoping to score a massive propaganda win. They showed off pieces of the wreckage and spoke of a new era where American drones would be hunted like birds of prey. But the U.S. Central Command was ready with a counterpunch that didn't involve a single explosion. They released decrypted GPS coordinates and flight data, proving the Global Hawk was 21 miles outside Iranian waters. It was a public execution of Iran's credibility, documented in real time by the very machine they had just destroyed. The world watched as the narrative of a heroic defense crumbled into a story of unprovoked aggression. To understand why Iran took such a massive gamble, you have to understand the philosophy of the IRGC. They've spent decades perfecting a strategy called A2AD, or anti-access, area denial. The goal isn't to win a conventional war against the United States. That's a suicide mission. Instead, they want to make the Persian Gulf so dangerous and unpredictable that the US military simply decides it's not worth the headache to stay. They use swarms of fast boats, underwater mines, and proxy forces to create a landscape of constant, low-level friction. The shootdown of the Global Hawk was supposed to be the ultimate proof that the price of American presence had become too high to pay. On paper, this asymmetric strategy looked brilliant, but it relied on a fatal assumption about how the U.S. Air Force operates. The Iranians viewed the drone as a single, isolated target that could be removed from the board. In reality, the Global Hawk was just one node in a vast, interconnected digital web. When the missile battery powered up to lock onto the drone, it effectively screamed its exact location and electronic signature to every American satellite and spy plane in the hemisphere. By destroying one terminal, Iran inadvertently gave the US the keys to their entire defensive kingdom. Every radar frequency and communication link used that day was recorded, cataloged, and prepared for neutralization. As the smoke cleared, the world held its breath for the inevitable rain of fire. In the Pentagon, the machines were already in motion. B-52 bombers were repositioned, Tomahawk missiles were fueled, and strike packages were finalized for the Iranian radar sites and missile batteries that had participated in the attack. Senior officials later revealed that the order to strike was approved and then pulled back with only 10 minutes to spare. The reason was cold and calculated. The estimated loss of 150 Iranian lives was deemed disproportionate to the loss of an unmanned machine. Iran read this hesitation as a sign of American weakness, but it was actually the ultimate display of dominance. What happened next was a masterclass in modern warfare that left the IRGC reeling and confused. While Iranian state media was still replaying footage of the drone's wreckage, US Cyber Command was launching a silent, invisible invasion. They didn't need to drop bombs to achieve their objectives. They executed one of the most sophisticated offensive cyber operations in human history, reaching directly into the heart of the IRGC's command structure. Suddenly, the very targeting systems used to shoot down the drone began to malfunction. Databases used to coordinate naval movements were corrupted, and the lights in the command centers began to flicker out in ways the Iranians couldn't explain. Iranian commanders found themselves in a waking nightmare where their own technology was turning against them. There were no headlines about this part of the war, and no dramatic footage for the evening news, but the damage was more devastating than any missile strike could have been. The US had demonstrated that they could reach inside Iran's military networks and turn them off at will, all while keeping American pilots safely out of harm's way. It was a brutal realization for Tehran. They had traded a physical drone for the total compromise of their digital infrastructure. They were fighting a war in 3 dimensions while the Americans were already operating in 5. The humiliation didn't stop at the border. Iran soon began leaning on its network of regional proxies to do the dirty work they could no longer handle directly. They funneled hundreds of cheap one-way attack drones to the Houthis in Yemen, hoping to overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume. The logic was simple: force the US to use million-dollar interceptors against drones that cost less than a used car. If they could drain the American missile stockpiles faster than they could be replenished, they could finally claim control of the shipping lanes. It was a strategy of attrition designed to bleed the superpower dry one small engagement at a time. But once again, the Iranian planners underestimated the adaptability of American naval and air power. U.S. Navy destroyers like the USS Carney became floating fortresses in the Red Sea, turning the drone swarms into expensive fireworks displays. Using a layered kill chain of sensors and rapid-fire weaponry, they intercepted dozens of threats in single engagements. The cheap drones weren't just being shot down, they were being used as live-fire training for American crews. Every failed attack provided more data on how the Iranian-made systems operated, allowing the US to refine their jamming techniques and automated defense algorithms to the point of near perfection. While the defensive systems were holding the line, the US Air Force began a surgical campaign to dismantle the supply chain itself. They didn't just wait for the drones to arrive. They went after the warehouses, the launch sites, and the logistics hubs that made the proxy campaign possible. These weren't massive, scorched earth bombings that would draw international condemnation. They were precise, localized strikes that removed key infrastructure with surgical accuracy. One by one, the tools Iran had spent years building were being erased from the map, leaving their proxy forces isolated and under-equipped in a theater that was becoming increasingly hostile to their presence. The Iranian Navy tried to run the same playbook in the Gulf, using fast attack boats to harass commercial tankers and buzz American warships. They used swarm tactics, weaving in and out of international lanes to provoke a response they could use for propaganda. What they didn't realize was that the US Fifth Fleet was maintaining a sensor picture so comprehensive that it bordered on omniscience. Every boat that left an Iranian port was tracked by satellites and underwater sensors long before it reached open water. American commanders knew the names of the captains, the fuel levels of the engines, and the exact intent of the mission before the first radio call was ever made. This level of situational awareness changed the entire nature of the confrontation. The restraint shown by American captains wasn't born out of fear or uncertainty. It was a deliberate choice backed by the absolute certainty that they could end the encounter in seconds if necessary. When IRGC boats tried to corner a tanker, they would find an American destroyer already positioned to block them, its weapon systems locked on with terrifying precision. The Iranians were playing a game of chicken against a wall of steel that didn't blink. Every time they pushed, they found that the US had already anticipated their move and neutralized it before it could even begin. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in Tehran about how modern American military power actually functions. They see a single ship or a single drone and think they see a vulnerability. What they fail to realize is that they are looking at a single finger of a massive global organism. The US military isn't just a collection of hardware, it's an integrated system of satellites, cyber assets, special operations teams, and deep-sea platforms that work in perfect harmony. When Iran attacks one part of that system, they trigger a response from the entire machine. It's a level of complexity and scale that the IRGC simply cannot match, no matter how many missiles they build. The brutal reality is that every time Iran escalates, they inadvertently hand over the blueprints for their own defeat. Each missile launch is a data point for American analysts to study. Each cyber attack is a signature that can be traced and countered. By trying to test the boundaries of American patience, Iran has allowed the US to map out their entire military apparatus in granular detail. They have turned themselves into a living laboratory for the development of the next generation of American warfare. The information gathered from these small provocations is being used to build targeting solutions that will be ready long before a full-scale conflict ever begins. The global community has been watching these engagements with intense interest, and the conclusions being drawn in places like Moscow and Beijing are sobering. They are seeing that the US no longer needs to engage in massive bloody wars to dominate a region. They can exert overwhelming pressure through a combination of precision strikes, cyber degradation, and economic isolation that leaves an opponent paralyzed. The brutal response to Iran's defiance wasn't a single catastrophic explosion. It was the steady, methodical dismantling of their ability to project power. It was a demonstration that the US can win a war without ever truly starting one. In the years since the Global Hawk went down, the IRGC has found its playground shrinking. Their most capable commanders have been removed from the battlefield with surgical strikes that sent a clear message: there is no place to hide. Their proxy networks are being squeezed by a combination of military pressure and financial sanctions that have made their operations increasingly unsustainable. Even their most advanced air defense systems have been shown to have critical vulnerabilities that the US can exploit at will. Iran set out to prove that the US was a paper tiger, but instead they proved that the tiger has digital teeth and a very long memory. The psychological impact of this one-sided struggle cannot be overstated. Iranian leadership is forced to tell their people that they are winning, even as their systems fail and their influence wanes. They broadcast images of old drones to hide the fact that their newest technology is being jammed into oblivion. This disconnect between propaganda and reality creates a fragile internal state that is increasingly difficult to manage. They are trapped in a cycle of provocation and quiet humiliation, unable to back down without losing face, but unable to escalate without inviting total destruction. The US has effectively placed them in a strategic straitjacket. Strategic planners in Washington are no longer reacting to Iranian moves. They are dictating the tempo of the entire region. They have achieved something called escalation dominance, where they control every rung of the ladder. If Iran chooses to use cyber attacks, the US responds with more powerful ones. If Iran uses proxies, the US dismantles the supply lines. If Iran uses direct force, the US shows them exactly how much of their network is already compromised. It is a state of perpetual checkmate where Iran's only move is to keep losing pieces while the clock runs out on their regional ambitions. Every time an Iranian radar technician flips a switch to track an American patrol, they are essentially signing a confession. They are revealing their location, their equipment type, and their level of training to an intelligence apparatus that never sleeps. This constant collection of data means that in the event of a real war, the first 5 minutes would likely see the total evaporation of Iran's entire defensive grid. The US doesn't need to guess where the targets are. They've spent years watching the Iranians point them out. It is a level of transparency that makes traditional warfare almost impossible for the IRGC to survive. The defiance Iran showed by shooting down that drone has ultimately backfired in the most spectacular way possible. It didn't drive the US out of the Gulf. It provided the justification for a more permanent, more high-tech, and more intrusive American presence. The US Air Force and Navy are now operating with a level of precision and confidence that has made Iranian threats feel like background noise. The waters remain international, the skies remain open, and the rules of the game are still being written in Washington, not Tehran. Iran tried to change the world, but all they did was remind the world who actually runs it. As we look at the wreckage of Iran's strategy, the lesson for other regional powers is crystal clear. Challenging a superpower isn't about how many missiles you have or how loud your propaganda is. It's about the depth of your technological architecture and your ability to operate within a global system. Iran chose to pick a fight with a system they didn't understand, and they are paying the price in a slow, agonizing loss of capability. The US response wasn't a tantrum. It was a cold, professional assessment that turned an act of aggression into a decade of strategic advantage for the American military. The ultimate lesson of this decade-long shadow war is that modern deterrence doesn't look like a mushroom cloud or a beach landing. It looks like a quiet room where a technician updates a targeting database based on a radar signature Iran accidentally revealed 3 years ago. Tehran tried to challenge the US Air Force and the entire architecture of American power, but the outcome wasn't a dramatic battle they could spin into a victory. It was a methodical, one-sided demonstration that the technological gap isn't closing, it's becoming an unbridgeable chasm. Somewhere, in an operations center Iran will never find, a specialist is still writing everything down, waiting for the moment they decide to turn the lights off for good.